is a bit of a reprise of his thinking, but in a sense, the meat of the book is the third part, where I interviewed 75 or 80 people from all kinds of walks of life, old, young, Turkish, Muslim, non-Turkish, non-Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Sikh, Hindu, here in Australia, not here, sorry, we're in New Zealand, in Australia, because I was in Australia 6 years ago. So I had occasion, 7 years ago, I had occasion to interview people in Australia, in the United States, Germany, France, people who were refugees from Turkey, people in Tbilisi, Georgia, where I do a bit of teaching every summer. So a wide range to get their responses to the questions, how did you hear about Gülen, or how did you hear about his net, or how did you meet Gülen, what causes you to be involved, to what extent are you involved, in what ways are you involved, do you have criticisms, and those kinds of basic questions. And the interesting thing, by the way, is that the book took an extra year to achieve publication, because when everything was finished, the publisher said, quite legitimately, we have to go back and check with everyone you interviewed to make sure they're still comfortable being in the book. Because the network of Mr. Erdogan, his outreach and his paranoia, and the way he can and has and does, and no doubt will continue to direct himself against anyone he perceives as oppositional to him, could give people fears for being in there, or they still have family there. So indeed, there were probably a dozen people or so who said, nah, I don't know. And then I proposed that we use pseudonyms. So in the end, a few people still were too nervous, so I said, fine, you don't have to be in the book. And there are a number of people in there with pseudonyms so that they feel safe and their families are safe. So this book is different because of all those interviews and what that leads one to understand, not just about Gülen, but about the Hizmet movement and what he had in mind and has in mind, and what inspires people like this gentleman here. You know, Peace Islands Institute, what are they all about? Why are there Peace Islands, Pearl of the Islands, because there's a Peace Islands Institute in New York, in the States. Pearl of the Islands, there are all kinds of organizations, there's an appendix with a list of them, all over the world. What is it they're about? Why are they doing what they're doing? What are they doing? So that's kind of, to get the full picture, of course, one must buy and read both books. I don't get a cut, so that's...
I looked really in the early digest. I was fascinated by your description of the mystical side of Rumi, who take it that you see as an intellectual wellspring for Gülen.
I do.
And your discussion of mysticism. Generally, as you were talking, I could feel my standing joke unpicking, which is that I have been wrong, I just don't remember the last time. That's it. To come back to the more recent things that you were talking about, and the book, do you see this book as, in a sense, a counter to the disinformation that you described being propagated about Gülen himself and about his movement? Because as a scholar of communication, and recently I gave a seminar on disinformation, so it's fresh in my mind, do you see this as what in olden times they would have called counterblast?
Yes, I do indeed. Alas, I am not a publicist. This does not have the audience that Mr. Erdogan can command easily enough, but it will have an audience, and to the extent that it gets more and more of one, I do see it exactly as a counterblast. In general terms and very specifically, I talk in 2 appendices at the end of the book, for example, one about why it's a fake coup, and why Erdogan hates Gülen, what it is that he fears about him that causes him to be so negative. But in general, yes, I feel that my intention was and is, and my intended audience was largely a non-Hizmet audience. It's an audience of Turks and non-Turks, Muslims and non-Muslims, who either, without having read anything really by Gülen, somehow don't like him, or they're afraid of him, or they don't understand, or confused. For people like that, to offer them information that would make them understand more about him and about Hizmet, and very much a counterblast to the steady stream of venom that comes out of the Erdoganian media.
Not that addicted to the other guy in the
Yeah.
media. I must drop that into a conversation sometime. When you think about this opposition, do you think that some of it comes from fear about what Islam stands for? Here you have on the one side a regime that I think we could, with, as they used to say, without fear of contradiction, describe as authoritarian, if not dictatorial. And I think about the fact that during the Nazi period, minority groups, whether they were Jewish or Christian, others were persecuted because not only were they vilified in terms of the ideology that the regime had, but they were also seen as undermining what the regime stood for. I'm wondering whether this, what Gülen and the Islamic movement stands for, is seen as that kind of threat. I'm not asking you to play the role of pop psychologist,
But I'm happy to.
please do.
First of all, I should point out that two comments that Erdogan made in about 2012, which is just at the edge of where his plan of subverting Turkish democracy is moving toward going into effect. One comment was that democracy is a train, and you have to know when to get off. And the other was a comment that slipped out, that, you know, the kind of government we need is the kind of government that Adolf Hitler had. So he is not just, in my mind, in pop psychological terms, an admirer of Adolf Hitler. He clearly has articulated himself that way. So your comment about, yes, anyone who opposes the regime, whether then for Hitler or now for Erdogan, is a potential victim of his animosity is certainly true. And I believe that he sees in Fethullah Gülen, with whom he had a collegial relationship for a long time, because it appeared that both of them were pointing in the same direction, which was furthering Turkish democracy while at the same time re-injecting into it more of a sense of its Islamic past, not at the expense of any non-Muslims being uncomfortable. And that's Gülen's vision. But Erdogan turned from that very distinctly in a number of ways. Gülen is a pious Muslim.
Yes.
He's also universalist. Erdogan, if you have followed him, is a fake pious Muslim. And in spite of the fact that he manages to convince a number of Turks that he's genuinely pious, it doesn't take much in following how he acts. I mean, both his public professions of piety, by praying in public, which is not a standard issue way of being a proper Muslim, but also everything else that he does, which runs contrary to what Islam is about at its best, presents someone who is not. So Gülen is the person who is constantly on his radar screen as being a true Muslim when he is not. If you're familiar with the story of Snow White, as some of you may be, if not, go back to your fairy tales. Snow White there is a wicked stepmother who has a mirror, and every morning she consults the mirror and she says, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror says, "Oh, you are, my lady." Except one morning, the mirror says, "Snow White is." And it drives, pop psychology, it drives the wicked stepmother absolutely crazy. And she cannot rest until she has found out where Snow White is and killed her, or at least tried to kill her. I picture Erdogan every morning looking in the mirror, ready for his day, and he sees Gülen looking back at him, calmly, quietly, smiling, humble, self-effacing, and genuinely pious. And it's got to drive him crazy. There is a very strong difference between the kind of Islam in which Erdogan believes and the kind of Islam in which Gülen believes. Erdogan believes in political Islam. Gülen believes in civil Islam. Civil Islam is Islam which is finding its way, figuring out how it fits in with the world. Political Islam is trying to conquer the world. So they have very different understandings of Islam. And so that, in a very distinct way, causes Gülen to be a threat by definition to Erdogan because he offers a different vision, a healthier vision, a happier vision, a non-autocratic vision, and these are things that I think must drive him crazy.
Yet they do. One of the things that was coming to mind as I was listening to you talking was the fact that, in my view anyway, and as I also like to use, I can't help it if I'm right, Gandhi,
Yes.
during British colonial times in India, subverted a whole colonial superstructure by his example of humility and failing to take the bait to violence that was then offered by the British colonial powers.
That's correct.
Is there a sense in which Gülen and the Islamic movement's example is having the same effect?
I don't know if it's having the effect in Turkey, but that he preaches a similar kind of absolutely nonviolent ideology. I suspect that when Erdogan ginned up the appearance of a coup and started the final stages of significantly and even violently suppressing his net and anyone else whom he perceived to be in opposition, I suspect that he was hoping for violent pushback. He was hoping that followers of Gülen would take to the streets with clubs. You know, they didn't, because Gülen's instruction is very emphatic. Do not respond that way. So in that regard, there is a very strong relationship. As I said, Gülen is connected to many, many different thinkers. So there is a strong relationship to Gandhi in this sense of nonviolence. The word that Gülen uses again and again, and in December, I almost said winter, but I realized I'm on the wrong side of the equator. In December of 2016, I attended a HISNET retreat for families from up and down the eastern seaboard. And everyone, of course, this was just months after the fake coup, is just, what's going to happen? Where are we going? And the message from Fethullah Gülen consistently was sabr, which is patience. One has to be patient, because ultimately, in Allah's good time, things will work themselves out. But under no circumstances will we be violent, and furthermore, we are open-hearted and ready to forgive, and when we forgive, if things change, it will not be in a kind of that sort of way, you know, pushing, but a wholehearted way, as if all the ugliness didn't happen, not as if it has to be remembered and somehow atoned for. I don't picture Erdogan ever transforming himself that way, but if he were to do so, Gülen would be the first to say nothing happened. So absolute, more than nonviolence in a way.
It's really taking this to an iconic level in the sense that here's an example that is not only relevant for Turkey but relevant internationally as an example of not resorting to violence, of not resorting to doing to them what they've done to us. But I used the word relevance a second ago. I want to ask, Gülen is resident in the US. He is quite some removed from where we are here on what some people call the bottom of the world and other people call the exciting edge of the world. So thinking about our situation, our context here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and you've been to Australia as well, what would you see as the key relevance of his teaching or the points that you make in the book to us here? We can read books, and as you rightly say, we should. We can hear speakers like yourself talk, but how can we, you call us here between thought and action, how is it possible to take the thought that we're hearing about and translate it into meaningful action?
Can I pit stop on my way to answer you?
Please.
By pulling out a word you used, iconic, simply to make another point, and it also connects to people who don't know about Gülen and who worry about him and his followers, because he is a kind of icon. But the thing about icons, and you know all about Eastern Christianity, is that there was a conflict for 150 years in Byzantium about whether they should all be destroyed, these images of Christ and the Virgin Mary and so on, because there was this concern on the part, his name was Leo III the Isaurian, the Byzantine emperor, that Christians were worshiping images, and that was idolatrous. And ultimately, that attempt to destroy all of them failed because what prevailed was the understanding that these images are not worshipped, they're venerated. There's a very important difference between worshiping and venerating. We worship God, but we can venerate prophets, saints, icons, if we're Eastern Christians, the text of the Quran or the Torah or the Gospels, all of these intermediaries that help us access God, we venerate, but we don't worship them. Gülen is someone who is venerated by his followers. They don't worship him, and he would be horrified. He's even horrified if he thinks they're venerating him, because he's far too humble to embrace the idea of his own veneration. So I now connecting that to your real question. He has written about, preached about, taught about 3 essential problems in the world. And I think at this point he would amplify that initial formulation, because at the time I don't think he was thinking, for example, about climate change, or other issues, but he talks about ignorance and poverty and disconnectedness between people, for which he has this prevailing ideology that we need to create mechanisms of education, we need to create mechanisms that help alleviate poverty, we need to create mechanisms that bring people together, and thinking and talking about it is insufficient. One has to act on it, and one has to act, and this is the adverb he uses again and again, or its Turkish equivalent, altruistically. So what I do not because I'm expecting some sort of a payback, except for the payback that it gives me satisfaction to do the right thing. I do for others rather than for myself, because I should do for others. And in his case, as a man of extreme faith, I do it because I love God, and God loves others. So if I love God, I've got to put that into action. I've got to walk the walk, not just talk the talk, and help others. By the way, another parenthesis, sorry, he has also commented, Gülen has, atheists who are doing good works are also doing God's work. They just don't know it. So his vision is not restricted to people of faith, although he happens to be one, and most of his followers happen to be people of faith. But they can be people of diverse faiths, first of all, but they can also be people of no faith. And if they're doing that kind of work, that's what counts. So it's the action that counts, and as a consequence, what is it that the hizmet, which is a Turkish word meaning service, what does hizmet do all over the planet? It builds schools. And often, more often than not, those schools, certainly I've been to many of them in different parts of the United States, but also in other parts of Africa, Asia, originally, before Erdogan closed them all down, in parts of Turkey where there are no schools or are no good schools, so that kids can get educated. I mean, among the many things that Erdogan has done to sink the ship of Turkey is to destroy all of the schools that were benefiting a population that will now not be educated, but that suits his dictatorial position much more effectively. So build schools, interfaith dialogues, iftar dinners that are interfaith, programs that bring people together, programs that alleviate poverty. Let me give you one example that sort of combines these things. And forgive me, it's an example from Sydney, Australia. It's not from New Zealand. But I haven't visited the schools here yet, so maybe I'll come up with something afterwards. It's a high school or a college in Sydney, and the 11th and 12th graders are tasked with growing organic vegetables on the land of the property of the school. So first of all, you can't learn in books what it takes to grow vegetables, what the farmer has to do to produce them, the concerns for the soil, the rain, the sun, the wind, the tending of them, the knowing when to sow the seeds and when to harvest, and all of that stuff, they're learning at a very practical level. They do it, not their teachers, they do it. Then they harvest them, and they sell around the neighborhood because they can't get organic vegetables in that part of Sydney at all. And then the funds that they earn get sent to a village. The year that I visited that school, it was going to Cambodia, a village in Cambodia. The year before, it had gone to a village in Tanzania that needed, that's the one I remember, needed a water system and didn't have the wherewithal. So they were both, it was part of their educational process, but it was also part of their alleviating poverty and creating social connections. It was all kind of rolled into one based on the idea of absolute altruistic kismet, service, right? And I've seen examples of that sort repeated again and again and again. That one just happens to stick out in my mind. I think I talk about it in the book. So therefore, what is the relevance of this relatively unknown Muslim cleric living in eastern Pennsylvania since 1999 for New Zealand or for Australia? And the answer is, his relevance is wherever there are people who are interested in helping other people. It's the importance of Hizmet, the importance of doing things that improve the lives of those around you. It's enormously relevant. And in some cases, for example, Auckland, for example, with the Pearl Islands organization, there happens to be an entity already in place to which people can become connected in performing service, just as it in turn is connected to the Anglican Church, to Bet Shalom Synagogue, and other organizations that have similar ideas in mind, because then it becomes part of the larger picture of working together. When Gülen started trying to solve the problem, which for him was the problem of Turkey in the 70s, his focus was on Turkey, and his focus was on Muslims. By the time of the 90s, he had morphed and come to this realization, it's not just about Turkey, it's not just about Islam, it's about the world. It's about all of us working together, because if we're not all working together for all of us, in the long run, none of us ends up benefiting. Which, by the way, is another way in which he is an offense to Erdogan, who is a Turkish nationalist, and to see this kind of vision that Gülen has is scary to him. And he's, of course, poisoned the atmosphere there. But already there were people afraid of Fethullah Gülen because either they're secular Turks, Kemalists, what are called white Turks, who feared because they, have you read any of Gülen? No. But I know. Well, how can you know if you haven't read him? They're afraid that he's somehow going to turn Turkey into Iran. No. Or you have Islamicists like Erdogan, who are upset at the fact that he is involved with all these other denominations. He's talking with the Pope, he's talking with the chief rabbi, that sort of stuff, which they find offensive because their intentions are more politicized. There Erdogan also falls in.
Thinking about the example of the school in Sydney that
yes.
you gave, and it sounds really great. Would it be a fair summary to say that for Gülen, spirituality involves getting your hands dirty, literally in the case of the kids at the school?
Absolutely. The cleanest hands are the ones that are dirtiest from having worked so hard. Absolutely.
I like that. Trying to think about where to go next. Gülen, like all of us, is aging. At some stage he will pass on. If you were in that situation where that has happened and made a long way away, and you were asked to describe his legacy, how would you summarize that?
So I have a two-part answer that I would offer you. First of all, he himself, of course, recognizes this.
Yes.
And one of the things that I've observed over the last 5 or 6 years in particular is that he has become less and less directly engaged in advising the various and sundry Hizmet leaders who come to him as to what they should be doing about this or that. Because he'll say, you know, you live in Auckland, I don't. You know better than I what to do there, don't ask me. And that's, I think, that's an active decision on his part to force Hizmet to become more and more independent in its network. it's connected. Everyone's connected, but independent in different situations, in different places, call for different solutions. Look, I was just in Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, Adelaide, Brisbane. Now I'm in Auckland. No two of those places, and this is just a small corner of the Islamic world, was exactly the same. The leaders whom I met, the audiences with which I spoke, I mean, everything is somewhat different. So that's what's so healthy about the organization. I think it will continue to flourish precisely because he has laid the groundwork, he sowed the seeds. I can mix all the metaphors I want, you know. And ultimately, everyone is going to be emotionally devastated, including myself, when he passes on. But at the same time, the organization itself is going to continue to flourish. And I would add a footnote to that, anticipating what might be someone's question, yours or someone else's. Not in Turkey. Because Hizmet, at the moment, of course, is in hiding in Turkey. Yes. It's there. But people who are involved, of course, have to stay hidden because, as you probably know, Erdogan has arrested 120,000, 130,000 people. And we're talking not just, you know, ugly old men like you and me. We're talking about beautiful women with children. In fact, he prides himself that in the prisons they've got, you know, playgrounds for the children because he's got the children in prison with their mothers. I mean, it's beyond belief. He's arrested more journalists than any country, including China, across the planet. I mean, the list goes on. So he's poisoned the world. He's poisoned the air, the water, the earth vis-a-vis Hizmet. So it's not as if when Erdogan goes, suddenly Hizmet will be welcomed back in Turkey. It will take a while. The anti-Semitism in Germany right after the Holocaust was more intense than during the Holocaust. If you go to Europe today, the country that is friendliest to Jews is Germany. But think how much time has passed. And it took a couple of generations for that to change. And I believe, I'd love to be wrong, but I believe that will be true in Turkey. However, just as the Jews found other places to flourish, Hizmet has found other places to flourish, and that's its obligation. That's what it's supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be spreading the wealth of education, alleviation of poverty, and all that stuff all over the world in 170 countries. Erdogan has managed to close down Hizmet schools, not just in Turkey, but any place where he can either bully or bribe. It's a very simple methodology. I bully or I bribe. Last night we were talking about Kyrgyzstan and the situation there where he essentially bribed the current leader, who has also modeled himself on Erdogan in other respects, as you may find out when you go there. But Hizmet is meanwhile everywhere else. And it's not going to stay the same as it moves from one generation to the next. The specifics, the particulars, and I think will change. But I will tell you two things. One, by coincidence, they happened within a week of each other. In February, I was at a conference, speaking at a conference in Houston, 250 kids, 18 to 25, young kids. And the energy and the enthusiasm was palpable. You could not walk away from that conference without confidence that there was a bright future of Hizmet. That doesn't mean they're going to do it the way their parents or their grandparents did it. That doesn't mean they're not going to disagree with certain things. They're going to change things. But the underlying values of serving others, of trying to deal with the world's problems across denominational and national and ethnic lines was very present there. A week later, again, they just happened to go that close. I was at a second Hizmet conference in Los Angeles. It was the first international conference since COVID. And there were 400 people from all over, I think it was 42 countries. Most of the papers given at the conference were given by members of Hizmet who were essentially reporting on projects in which they and their communities were engaged, and they were from South America, Central America, Africa, Asia, North America, Europe, Greece, which doesn't have a long history of a love relationship with Turkey. So symbolic and symptomatic of where Hizmet has gotten communities that have a traditional, not friendly relationship with Turkey, most obviously the Greeks and the Armenians, are in many places engaged with Hizmet, because Hizmet speaks a completely different language, which is a universal language. So I see an expansive future when he goes, in spite of the devastating emotional effect of his going.
So, excuse me, your experience with these two conferences would lead you to feel that that embracing the principles that are if you like, the lodestar for the Islamic movement is something not just for those of us who may be a little more mature than others in terms of years, but also very much relevant to the youth of today.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of comes full circle to where he began, because his first interest was in youth. And so what did he do? He was the imam in a mosque. He'd give his khutbah, the Friday noon service, but he realized there are no kids out there. So he started going to cafes, and he'd get into a conversation with a kid, or with two, or with three. And before you know it, there are 15 or 20 kids kind of gathered around, eagerly listening to him. And he's not just talking about the Quran and Hadith, he is talking about that. But any questions you ask, tell us about Darwin, talk to us about Einstein, because his extraordinary, and it is extraordinary, breadth and depth of understanding of a whole range of different kinds of thinkers and interest in that range made him capable of addressing a youthful audience and not just an older audience. So he can only smile. You know, the root of the word Gülen means smile. Gülen. So he can only smile when he hears about what's happening with youth. The first couple of times that I had the privilege of visiting with him, I was asking him questions. The last few times, and I'm hoping, inshallah, that I will see him again next month, that I've been with him, I felt like a reporter to him to tell him what's going on, because he has his sense of the world and its problems resting on his shoulders, his concern for his men. It all rests on his shoulders. And, you know, when I was in Tbilisi, Georgia, a couple of years ago, and I met with a couple of individuals who had just managed to come over the border after a year of being in hiding. And they said, when you see Hajj Effendi, you tell him we're really doing well. He doesn't have to worry about us. So I can't wait. That's why I'm hoping I will get to see him, to talk, for example, about all that I've learned and seen in this corner of the world, which is, of course, so exciting.
That's fantastic. Now, I think we're at the point where we should open things up for questions, comments from anyone.
Anyone? Paul, I know you've got to leave early. How's that for questions?
One for the
I thought you might have one quick question before you left, but no pressure. No pressure.
Well, all I can say is that it is wonderful that this message is going around the world and that it's being received by people of different faiths and different cultures, and that they can all benefit from it and recognize not only what's happening in Turkey, but there is an answer to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
on to your next. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much. Appreciate that. What other comments or questions we have around 15 or so minutes before the scheduled wrap-up time?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, a lovely talk. And I just wanted to, how you said, G. Effendi, 40 years ago his sermon is, talked a bit, more focused on, the people of Turkey.
Yes.
And do you think or believe, or I do kind of believe that he had a vision of the world even maybe 50 years ago, but Turkey and Turkish people weren't ready to obviously, embrace, because there were other, things that they needed to focus probably. But to be able to get people ready 20 years later,
Yes.
I think, as you said, you need to be patient and
Yes.
sober and just, do it in a time and slowly.
That's certainly possible, because one of the things I have observed of him and his relationship to his men is he's always 2 steps ahead. Okay? The criticism that I had in my initial encounters with his men was the women are in the kitchen and in the living room having soft beds. There need to be more women in the living room. So two things. One, at that retreat that I mentioned in December of 2016, I met with about 20 kids. They were 18 to 30. I don't remember the exact number, but there was about, as I said, 20 of them. About a dozen were female and about 8 were male. And the hands went up as soon as I made that comment from the girls. They said, that's changing. It's not that way at all. And it was equally clear, if I fast forward to just this past February, at the conference that I mentioned in Houston, that there is a huge, enthusiastic engagement and involvement on both sides of the gender border. And in fact, I was in Rochester, New York, at a conference just 2 or 3 weeks ago. It was not a HISMET conference, but 2 of the participants were HISMET people, so they invited me to do a brief conversation at the Turkish Cultural Center there in Rochester. And a young girl came up to me, whom I recognized, of course, because she'd been at the conference in Houston. And she'd come back from that conference, all juiced up, and she and her friends started a podcast. It's all about the Prophet Muhammad. So she said, would you speak on our podcast? My point being, she wasn't waiting for some guy to do it. She was doing it. They were doing it. So, and the other part of my comment is, and talking to people, I understand that Hajj Effendi's idea way back was a more gender even kind of playing field. But taking as his starting point Turkey and its cultural history, he felt his followers weren't quite yet ready for that. So that's not something he pushed. He thinks that the arts are important. That's why you find the arts present in his next schools. But most of certainly his early constituencies, were not overly interested or focused on or appreciative of the arts. Sports, he covers the whole gamut of interest and awareness, and his sense of what's important covers that whole gamut. So he's always 2 steps ahead. So that's true. What I said was, in terms of what I read from the 70s, it was much more Turcocentric and much more Islamocentric in its focus. But that it may well be, now that I think about it, thanks for the question, he already has in mind, at that point, the broader vision that starts gradually to emerge by the end of the 80s and into the 90s. Very possibly. And it doesn't matter. If it wasn't there, he changed. Either way, it's where you get to that is more important. And at the very least then, for the last 35 years, his vision has been extremely broad. Even if it wasn't earlier on, but it may well have been earlier on. His personal tapia, they're not ready yet.
I won't even ask you what you might think about the 32 gender categories recognised in New Zealand law.
I think he'd probably shake his head like most people.
Most of us
Yeah.
would. I know there'll be other questions, but I did want to ask you one that other people may wish to jump in on too. One of the things that comes out strongly in the first part of your book, by the way, did I hear that we're not going to let people know who we're carrying a problem? No, forget that. But one of the things that comes through very clearly at the beginning of your book is just his devotion to God.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't escape it, not that one would necessarily wish to, but you can't escape that theme just coming through again and again and again. Now, we might say, that's okay for him, but how do the rest of us stimulate, foster, whatever word you want to use, a similar kind of devotion as the foundation of moving, as your book says, from thought to action?
Right. And I think he would say, don't worry about it.
Really?
Do the do, and the faith will come with it. Or if your starting point is faith, make sure it leads to action. I don't think it would be egotistical of him, and that's the last thing that he is, to expect everybody to emulate his model. I mean, he comes from an extraordinary background. His parents were ridiculously pious, and his parents' his lineage on both sides. So he came by naturally, but at the same time, none of his siblings became what he became because he was particularly drawn to it. I mean, he's already praying with the adults when he's 4, and wanting to make sure he gets all the rakats right and understands how salat is proper and what dua is and what it means to add dua to salat and all that. He's already trying to figure that when he's 4. By the time he's 9 or 10, he's a hafiz. He's memorized the Quran. So aside from obviously prodigious memory and intellect, he just had that inward piety. I think when I look for a comparison, the person I think of, oddly enough, and of course in this library I noticed a number of books about her, is St. Catherine of Siena, because she had a very early sense of calling. And there's this story that when she was 5, she disappeared and her father went frantically looking for her, and he saw her sitting by a fountain, and he saw that there was a dove on her head. And as he approached, the dove suddenly went, and in Christian symbolism, the dove is the symbol of the Holy Spirit. So her father understood that the Holy Spirit was resting on her, and that's when he understood that he should not try and get in the way of her, the pious direction she was leaning toward, which was, in her case, in the Christian tradition, a monastic direction.
Right.
But what happened to her? She has a number of visions, and the one that she has when she is about 24 is, get out of the monastery. You have to be doing things out in the world. That's what she hears Christ saying to her. She leaves Siena. This is the 14th century. There's a young single woman journeying from Siena to Avignon, which is where the papacy had been in residence at that point for almost 75 years. And she convinces the Pope, Gregory XI, clearly huge amount of charisma, that this is not where you belong. You need to be in Rome. That's where you should go. And he says, I will go to Rome if you will come with me as my advisor. So she is that kind of an extraordinary character who, at a very, very early age, felt called to something deeply spiritual, but who in the end recognized that she had to translate it into, in her case, a particular action. In Fethullah Gülen's case, it's a broader concept of action, but it's also this very early piety that then spreads its wings beyond just thought into action. But his comments to us would be, I think, don't worry about how pious you are or you aren't. Do the best you can, but more importantly, harness your piety to action. And as I said, he's also made that comment about atheists, that an atheist can be a person of proper pious action, even though an atheist would not call it piety.
So an action can spur the piety that
Sure.
later you realise that behind a certain action that might, for want of a better term, or it's not a bad term at all, bless people,
Yes.
you might later realise, well, that is an action that God has somehow put his hand upon, and so the spiritual understanding follows the action. I think that's what I hear you saying.
Yeah, it can.
Yeah. More questions?
You were talking earlier about how many people don't know the true story, and so they see Gülen is the leader, and that was our experience as we were preparing for this tonight, and we were talking to people, and there were intelligent people involved in interfaith who had no idea about the Islamic movement and what was actually going on. Do you think the world should have censored Gülen far more than has actually happened?
Do I think yes, but I'm a realist. Erdogan serves a political purpose for the United States, for Europe, for Russia, for sure. So that's not likely to happen. So the solution to the irony is that his attempt to destroy his net has put it more on the map than it was before. Speaking again from the perspective of the States, which is obviously where I live and where I mostly move about, when I mentioned, someone asked me, "Oh, you're going to Australia to do a book tour about who? Who's Fethullah Gülen?" I said, Eastern Pennsylvania. Oh, the guy in Eastern Pennsylvania whom Erdogan. They all know about him through that angle, and therefore they knew about his net through that angle, but they don't necessarily understand much about it. So all I can do is say, read my book, or read these other books, or read what he's written. And all I can say to Hizmet people, and people who are affiliated, associated, anyway with Hizmet, to keep doing what we're doing, to keep doing what you're doing. And you can't worry about the fact that, you know, Erdogan is still out there like the wicked stepmother. And you can't worry about the fact that there's still so many people who don't know who he is. We just have to keep working at it. You know, there is an important turn of phrase in the rabbinic tradition, in the Talmud. It's a work that's called the Sayings of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot. And it is the day is short, the work is great, the master is urgent. It's not incumbent upon you to finish the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. So, this is an urgent issue. It's not incumbent upon us to finish the work, but we have to keep working at it. Other question, or did you?
Can we make this the last one, because we have respect for everyone's schedules. We want to finish more or less on time if we can.
More.
Sure. My question stems out of curiosity of your journey, of what made you put your thought into action, and what was your source of inspiration? Was it your calling that you decided to put pen to paper?
In general, or specifically this?
This one, but in general of your first book, like you shared quite good enlightenments. Definitely you have mentioned prophets and Muhammad. I come from a different faith, but there were some things that talked to me directly.
I don't know, I don't remember when I started becoming interested in religion, you know, and the myriad ways in which, as a species, we have tried to access God. And at what point, and I don't remember exactly at what point I realized, I thought, you know, every religion is by definition governed by a sense of revelation, right? Religio in Latin means binding back. So we want to be bound back to that source. But the problem with that source and the revelation is, what language does it speak? Can I really ever understand what it's saying? So every history of every religion, which starts with revelation, very quickly becomes interpretation. So if I'm thinking of Islam, by 632, there's been a 22-year period of revelation, and then the prophet's gone. And clearly there are issues, because immediately there's a schism between the followers of Abu Bakr and the followers of Ali. But that pattern, which reflects an interpretational issue, will be found in every single religion, which is fine, because I think that's part of God's game, so to say. We are not just empowered, we are burdened with the obligation to try and understand what the revelation means. And the only problem is when I decide that my interpretation is the only correct form. So then I've relegated myself to a position of God, or at least a prophet, I know what it means. I know what God knows. So whether that is a pharaoh 45 centuries ago in Egypt, or whether it's a presidential candidate in the United States who says, you elect me, I'm going to make America the Christian country that God intended it to be, and everything in between. The problem is not revelation, the problem is mistaken revelation for interpretation. So I don't know when I became interested, but it's been a long history for me, and I have seen my own path as trying to introduce this community that doesn't know about that community to that community. So at the College of Jewish Studies in Cleveland, I was teaching them about Islam and about Christianity. In my lectures on Western civilization at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, which is expected to be largely Christian, I'm introducing them to Judaism and to Islam, and so on. A lot of my courses, and then it turns out my books derive from that. So I was sort of primed perfectly for someone like you. And as I said, it took me over a year of kind of research and reading before I felt comfortable with him, because I started out where everyone else, not everyone, where many other people do. Not sure. I met him after I wrote the first book, and that elevated things to a whole different level, because I still get goosebumps. you have admired some movie star, some sports star from a distance, and then you meet that person, and there's such a disappointment because they're not. With him, it was the opposite. I didn't know what it was going to be like to meet him, and it was like overwhelming. His sense of charisma, his sense of humility, his sense of concern for others, his sense of aura. I don't know how else to put it. I don't have the right words. And the bromance began there, and I've never turned back from it. And each time I've seen him, I've had the same feelings.
Thank you very much for that. You were talking about language, of course. For some Christian denominations, God speaks in the language of King James, and
Yes.
etc. I understand you've been doing some hand exercises, getting ready for signing books. So we have some books on the table out there, and I encourage you to head that way. Don't even look at the remains of the refreshments, just head straight for the table. And thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you
We
also.
really appreciate your being with us. And please continue to keep your eyes and ears out for future Pearl of the Islands events. Thank you again, and thank you to our distinguished
Thank you,
guests.
Chris. Thank you, and thank you, and thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you. We do have some goodies for you that,
The presenter.
yes.
So you are released now to head in the direction that I'm encouraging you to take. And I believe my distinguished friend here is ready to
Sign books. Yes.
sign books. And
Before-
thank you so much.
Sorry, everyone. In terms of notices, because I am that person for you tonight, we have given you a flyer for the next event, which is the Abraham Faith Hub, in collaboration with these wonderful organisations. Please do try and attend. If you'd like the invitation link, just email us and we'll send it through to you. Thank you.
Can I just say a little bit more about what it actually means, life's journey, our religious practices? We're going to be looking at the life cycle events, birth through to death, and talking about the practices